Hello, everybody. This is Michael Siggins from the Channel Pro Network, and I want to thank you very much for attending our webinar today. Today's topic is only multi-vendor protection can keep today's businesses secure, and we are really very happy to have Webroot today making this webinar possible. Before we kick things off, I just want to cover a few kind of housekeeping items to help you get the most out of the presentation today. This webinar is live, and we are scheduled to go for about an hour, so we hope you've cleared your schedule for that. We always encourage as much participation as possible from you, our audience. And if you look down in the lower left side of your window, there of your browser window, you'll see a little chat area. If you've got questions for us, please feel free to type them in, and we will do our best to get them as kind of time and format allow today. So without further ado, I want to now pass things on to our esteemed presenters. We have Michael Walsh, COO of Independence IT, and also George Anderson, Director of Product Marketing at Webroot. Gentlemen, please take it away.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. It's George Anderson here from Webroot. Today I'm going to look at really multi-vector protection from an endpoint view and how to secure devices and users. And Mike will follow on with sort of like another, sort of what I say, a very complementary way of also securing your devices by using the cloud to do that as well. So, things, multi-vectors, multi-layers, security tends to be about those things and not just about singular things. Yep, that's good. Just getting a slide to advance, sorry. So, really to start with, I'd like to start with the concept that really security is about securing the user and the device. And I think more and more we're seeing, security education and areas like that start to come into people's, field of vision. It's been something that's, especially the user education side, something that's been paid very little lip service to, if you like, over the last few years. But people are realizing that, phishing and ransomware and a lot of these things start with some form of social engineering, some manipulation of the user, or the user not being aware of the impact of some of the things that they're actually doing. So very key concept to grab. And I'm not going to go into that much more, except I'm going to discuss the next topic there, which is the identity and privacy shield. And again, not a long time on that, but to give you some idea about ways in which we protect the user. And then I'm going to look more typically at some of the threats that we're facing today and why something like multi-vector protection in action and how that works and some of the ways we help prevent users from being further infected as well and being compromised in any way. And then obviously I'll hand over to Mike, who's going to take you on to looking at the cloud workspace area. So if we look at the protecting the user, a key aspect of that is that, you try to protect the user, their credentials and, their privacy, if you like, when they're using a browser, because that's a time when they can very easily be compromised. And that's why, in fact, we built in really what many people would consider a consumer-type idea, and it's probably maybe because of our background, and we started off as a consumer company and protecting consumers and still do so today, but we realized that, consumers were going to be doing online transactions, going to be doing their banking, accessing particular sites, whatever, which they want to keep maintaining and keep their privacy. So it's specifically designed in some ways. We did this technology specifically designed those people from doing that. And we felt that businesses were going the same way. You're accessing applications in your business, you're accessing Salesforce online, you're accessing a whole lot of different tools and online tools. So it's very important that that user is protected from those things. So what we have is really a kernel level lockdown of the operating system and browser, which neutralizes things like phishing, DNS poisoning, keystroke logging, screen grabbing, cookie scraping, clipboard grabbing, and really other sort of what I call browser and session hijacking by malicious software. The neat thing about this technology is that it also allows the administrator to, apart from protecting your browsers, any other exe file or any other executable on your machine, you can also put in this sort of bubble, if you like, and protect from being sort of spied on in any way or gone into. So that's very much up to the administrator whether they want to extend that. So sometimes they extend it to Office apps like Excel, for instance, where they might have confidential figures and things in there, and they don't want the thought that somehow there's something on the device that would be grabbing that information. This sort of identity and privacy shield does a lot of things. It verifies each website a user goes to and make sure it's not being a redirection or something's going on there. That's not one of our threat intelligence blacklists. it verifies that DNS IP resolution, trying to detect if there's a man-in-the-middle attack taking place, and if so, it can obviously block that from happening. It stops websites from doing things that they typically do these days, which is create what we call lots of tracking cookies and high-risk tracking cookies to gather information, and it blocks third-party cookies also from installing if the cookies come from malicious tracking sites. So we obviously maintain a list of tracking sites to do that. And of course, it prevents programs from accessing, users' protected credentials. For example, their login credentials, etc., same as name and password, or a website request, that as such. So a very powerful way of protecting the user, because it basically puts them in a safe environment, even when they're in an unsafe environment, and tries to to very much protect them at that particular level. When we come and look at the actual endpoint and protecting the device, analysts are sort of a good view of this, and actually I think, and there's Gartner, and this particular example is Forrester, and you can see it's from their Endpoint Security Suite's Q4 2016. In fact, something we didn't participate in, but that's another story, as they say. But they go on about how to protect the device, and they see that as a multi-stage process of prevention in the first place, detection and remediation, and it's very much the model actually that we follow and have followed since we launched Webroot Security Anywhere, back in 2012 to businesses. In fact, Gartner add one thing to this. They add prediction, and that actually is something we do. We try and predict as well, especially when files are being downloaded, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a minute. So just to say that when you're looking at endpoint technology, some of the things you should be measuring it by are these three criteria. How well does it prevent? And to me that would mean protecting the user and prevent things from coming down onto the machine in the first place, and what controls does it have to stop that happening. Then if things are landing on the machine, how well does it detect? What's it using for that? Is it using behavioral context building? Is there intelligence integration? All those things. These are Forrester's words, not mine, by the way. And then remediation, very important, is how do you contain that attack? How do you remediate vulnerabilities? How do you remediate the machine? And configuration management is part of that too. But it's just the things to start looking for. So, really to look at what happened in 2016. Most of security vendors and ourselves, we have some sort of half-yearly results about now. But basically, we're still looking back at what happened and the trends that happened in 2016. And when we look at that, this is the Verizon data breach investigation report. I like this report because it's independent, really, of our industry. It looks at asking questions of a lot of organizations. It's been running for quite a long while now, so it's become quite established, and more and more organizations are contributing to it. So they actually, their survey for 2016 found that phishing was behind 90% of security incidents and breaches in 2016. So that maybe also explains why, when we talk about multi-vector and multi-layer, people are talking about starting to protect individuals from that, because obviously phishing is because individuals have clicked on something. They have done something they shouldn't have done. And hey, if I was an individual, and even as a security individual, I know that I can be spoofed by these things too, even with the education part of it. So the education helps, but it doesn't solve everything you need more than one defense. Other thing from our side of the view is when we look at all the infections that occurred last year and all the malware that we identified, 94% of that malware was unique to that single endpoint and to that single individual machine. So what we're trying to say there, it does say traditional signatures are useless. It means it's very unlikely that a signature-based system is going to catch that. Though most people have moved away from being entirely signature-based, there's still quite a few systems out there that are quite heavily still signature-based and require lots of manual updating. And I would say, those things are not really going to help very much at all, and it's like a bit of a wasted effort. So let's look at multi-vector and look at that stage of things and how that transpires. We really see that as almost a life cycle. Actually, I had one of my salespeople this morning say, "Is this a kill chain?" And actually, I don't think this is a kill chain. I think a kill chain is something slightly different. Though, in fact, it's working almost in the same way as a kill chain. It's looking at the different stages of the attack. So obviously, the attack stage, you have your email and web, it's going to come through email. It's going to come through the web browser. It come through display ads, advertising, hyperlinks, files, social media apps when you're browsing social media. There's lots of different ways, in fact, that you can be attacked these days, and some of them are multiple ways at the same time as well, which makes things even more complex, if you like, to defend against. And obviously, things just standard things like DVDs or CDs or USB drive. So we have a number of technologies and shields and things that we use at that stage to try and divert that from happening. Then there's the actual payload stage where you're actually going to get something delivered. So the delivery is usually adware, spyware, ransomware, whatever, it's phishing attacks, keyloggers, whatever. It's that payload stage, and the payload's actually coming down, and that's when you're trying to predict very much in any case what you can do about it and how you can stop that. And then finally, you get the infection and remediation stage, and how do you handle that when the machine is becoming infected or it's being infected? How do you sort of protect the machine during that stage? How do you help to then remediate it back to a good known state? I would say that this, by the way, is not unique. There are other endpoint vendors in the industry that follow a slightly similar model. I think what's unique is the way that Webroot do it compared to others, but that's probably too much for us to dive in completely in this webinar. But it's interesting. But we see this as a very obviously effective way of controlling things. And I think the real reason, as I said, that in some ways that other people don't do it quite so well is that they haven't architected to use sort of real-time information, cloud-based threat intelligence all the time to do that. Whereas, we started off, and when we launched in 2012, we were a next generation vendor in a field of antivirus vendors, if you like, and we're already using something machine learning, AI, all these real-time things and big data and things to do that computation. And the market has slowly, both the traditional vendors and some of the newer vendors are catching up with that model and trying to use that as well to help them do it, because they saw actually that we were getting very successful results from that. So a little bit forward, obviously I've picked phishing attack because as that Verizon thing I think is shocking. The fact that 9 out of 10 security breaches they could put down to a phishing attack, and also phishing is intimately sort of associated with ransomware. I mean, and one of the things I quickly mentioned there is that people worry a lot about the ransomware side of it, and also it's terribly concerning, but actually during that ransomware attack, it's quite likely other attacks are going on at the same time. So it's not necessarily even a single attack that's going on. It's just the ransomware is the sort of the visible side of it, because it could have been that they actually landed there and started to export data and take data away from the device before they encrypted. And there's a whole lot of things that can go on. So just think of it. Don't think of it necessarily as just a single thing going on. So this is a typical example. You receive an email, you receive a phishing email. It's from the United States Postal Service or wherever it happens to be, and they say, hey, you've got to track this package, and of course it's landing at the right time, and you're expecting a package. It's quite likely that the user is going to click on that. That obviously opens a browser, starts a session up, and takes them to a malicious site maybe, and maybe that's it. That's all they need to do. Down comes the malware. So I'm just trying to take you through an example of how we would handle and deal with that. So someone said to me that these actually come in at the right state. I think vendors we slightly cheat to explain things. We sort of simplify things. So this is simplified. It's not necessarily precisely the way things work, but it gives you a good idea of what we're trying to do at each attack stage and delivery stage, and how we handle the infection remediation, which I think is quite important. So we've got something called the Web Threat Shield that very simply looks at all the URLs, looks at what that user is trying to click on, and says, do we know that IP address? Do we know it as a malicious domain? Do we know it as all those things? And we can very quickly filter out a whole lot of, if you like, malicious traffic at that stage. Anything we know about at that particular point in time, we can basically, as malicious, we can block and control there. And when I say know about, you've got to think we handle something like 500 billion objects a day. We run IP intelligence services. We run URL intelligence services, not only for ourselves, but for about 50 other vendors. So we have a vast amount of data being, going through our system to feed that Web Threat Shield and have it bang up to date all the time. So a lot happens there. But still, the thing is about those things, one layer is never going to be absolutely perfect in that environment. So at the next stage, what we do is we say, okay, you're clicking on that link as a user. You're going to try and go to that site, and you're going that way. So if we haven't sort of cut it out at the Web Threat Shield stage, we have something called a real-time anti-phishing service. That is literally as real-time. It's interceding on behalf of the user, and it's actually then performing a whole lot of checks, if you like, on behalf of the user in milliseconds about what that site's all about. So we're checking that site in a whole lot of other different ways. And as I said, there's a whole whole lot of algorithms, a whole lot of machine learning, a whole lot of other things being applied at this stage for us to then sort of determine whether that's a phishing site or not with a very, very high degree of accuracy. And really between those two things, we cut out about 99% of phishing attacks and completely make sure that the user's not infected at all. I say 99%, and again, that's like a vendor-typey figure. But what I'm really trying to say is that we're not going to be 100%, even with all this in place and this amount of machine learning and AI and threat intelligence all applied to it. We can never be absolutely 100%. So we get pretty close. Actually, real-time anti-phishing is probably a little bit higher than 99%, but 99% is a good way of looking at it. And it sort of goes on because obviously people can get infected. So next stage, something's come down, it's coming to the browser. We have a file, and I would call this the predictive stage to a certain extent. We don't need to necessarily look at the whole file. We can look at partially what's coming down. We start to analyze that, and we start to say, and we compare it with our real-time shield. And our real-time shield simply has access to about 9.5 billion bits of information that we hold about endpoints and what's bad and what's good, etc. So it basically instantly checks, and it can predict on partial files. It doesn't need the whole file to say whether this is something we know is known good or is something we think. In fact, it's whether it's known bad is what we're really checking. But we're going on at that stage. So a very interesting thing, and again that cuts out and reduces some of the things that we have missed with the previous defenses, but actually getting on from there. Next stage is really the behavioral stage, and people talk about behavioral thing. We used to call this our unknown. In fact, we still do call it really our unknown. So what we're doing then is, something is likely. We don't know what it is at all. And this is a very unique thing which Webroot does here is that we sort of work in I suppose the best way to describe it as a containment strategy, because it's not a sandbox, it's not emulation, it's none of the things that people typically want to label you as doing. They just say we work on a containment strategy, and we look at the actual behaviors, what it's trying to do. Is it trying to write to the registry? Is it trying a whole variety of different things that we look at, and we're using that to determine very, very rapidly whether that's malicious intent or it's benign intent at all. It's not something where the actual software can realize is it running in that environment or anything like that. So it's because there's some ways if you're running things like sandboxes and some of the things that there's some malware out there that's very clever about saying actually I'm running in an artificial environment. I'm going to do nothing until I feel I'm onto a real environment. So the Behavior Shield does a lot of that work. And I said that the unique thing really at that time is that most other products and solutions have got to make a decision then and there. In other words, they're making it within those milliseconds. They're deciding is this bad or is it, and I'm going to stop it, or I'm going to do nothing because I think it's good. Whereas we will spend time. If we cannot ascertain that, we will actually spend time. We'll keep the containment going, and we'll keep protecting the endpoint. We'll keep monitoring and journaling what the endpoint is doing, so we can actually protect that endpoint from being fully infected and fully compromised, which is really what's going on. You're being infected at this stage, and we're sort of almost monitoring the infection status, if you like, as it goes along. But what we are able to do then, of course, is stop that. As soon as we can determine with a very high accuracy whether that's malicious or not, we can stop that. And we can actually then, because of our monitoring and journaling and various auto-remediation, we can take that machine back to where it was before this file actually downloaded, before this activity started. And it's by combining all of these things together, and this is, as I said, is an oversimplification, but it's a good way of trying to describe it to people. This is what we're doing to sort of stop malware from getting down. And as I mentioned, if you're working on if you're a single version type approach, you really get this block or allow type thing going on. Not necessarily at the delivery stage, but sometimes at the delivery stage, sometimes it's slightly later on. One of the things antivirus vendors do is talk about where in the stack they're stopping the attack or the infection happening. And obviously, as you can see, we use multiple places in the stack to try and stop the infection or the exploit or whatever, or the script or whatever it is that's happening to run. As I said, this is obviously has to be an oversimplification to try and present some quite complex information. So one of the other things I think that particularly, working for Webroot, I'm very sort of proud of is we actually publish how well we stop malware. I mean, we find actually that independent external tests are very inaccurate at doing that. You get lots of people getting 100% results, and that's impossible, that people are getting infected even if they're using those particular defenses and devices, and how the heck could that be happening? I could be getting 100%. So we're a bit sort of unhappy with the way that testing goes on, and I know others are as well. I know other next-gen vendors complain about the same thing too from a different side. And again, it's because of the way I tend to think it's the way we work. It's the fact that we can actually contain something over a period of time. So this sort of explains that in another way. So last year we saw 1 in 40 new executables that we saw. So exe files, if you like, were malware. The majority of those, well over 80%, we stopped literally in nanoseconds, instantly, just basically that. And then of what was left, 56% of those were done within about an hour. And then when you get to the far end of the chain there, 12 hours and 90% of the remainder stopped over a 12-hour period. And then overall, we had an overall efficacy of about 99.7% plus. 99%, what I said, is the minimum, which we think is a highly effective rate, and basically, as good as anybody else's real world efficacy in the business that we end up stopping malware. So again, something when you think about A/B tests, and you think of asking people about how well they stop malware, I wouldn't ask them how well they stop it. I'd say, do you know what your infection rates are? Do you know how many people get infected using your product? Because that actually is a rather more interesting thing to look at. I can see somebody's raised a hand there, so I'm going to get a question later on about that. So that's good. So that's great. Make sure you're asking a question. One of the things I think is very interesting is obviously we use machine learning, we use AI, and one of the things is how well do we classify malware, and why do we take this time, by the way, during that containment period, why are we worried about spending time in that? And the real answer to that is we're very aware of the fact that we don't want to create any false positives or false negatives. So a false positive is obviously you classify something bad as good, and then a false negative something good as bad. So actually looking at this actually score distribution is a little bit inaccurate, because it looks at everything we put through our threat intelligence platform, and it looks at the either side of the things that are accurate and inaccurate. And obviously, really the key thing is the false positive rate on the right hand side. You can see that's almost flat. So our false positive rate is absolutely minuscule, and that's how we keep it that way, and that's how we're very accurate about what we do. And if we classify something as malware, a high percentage of the times, going into many sort of noughts, it is accurate because of that. So I'd just like to close out before I hand you over to Mike. Just some things I think I want to conclude on and summarize on. Really, ideally, attacks should be stopped before an infection even executes, before it gets there. So anything you can do to protect the user, whether that's education or whether it's in a product, wherever else, that's going to be the ideal scenario. But with that velocity, variety, and success rates of attacks, the only way to actually combat those things is to have something which offers you multiple ways of stopping it when it is trying to come there. The other thing to bear in mind is you need things like secure online connectivity, identity and privacy protection, and real-time prevention. And that's partly going to steal some of Mike's thunder, because he's going to start to look at how you get that. You can wrap that up in a different way if you like, and still add another layer if you like. And as I said, I think really look for technology that secures both the user and the device at every stage of their sort of interactions, and their workplace interactions. So that's very key too. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Mike. And thank you all. And just as I said, we'll do questions at the end.
Well, thanks a lot, George. Wanted to start out by thanking Webroot and Channel Pro for hosting the webinar today. And as George mentioned, we're a big fan of because attacks can be multi-vector, to also come up with different layered strategies for how we actually defend against those. So just a little bit about Independence IT to start. We create what's called the Cloud Workspace Suite, and the primary purpose of the platform is to use cloud environments, both public, Google, Azure, Amazon Web Services, and privately hosted infrastructure providers to host workspace sessions so that users can do their work and work with their applications and data in the cloud as opposed to on physical desktops and devices. We focus on the automation and the workflow required for the provisioning and the management of those components so that you can focus on delivering the customized and configuration environment for the end clients. So we see it as an approach that allows us to look at the security profile from a different perspective. And I just wanted to back up what George said in the sense that we have a number of ways that malicious parties are trying to get at the information and the applications and the environments that we work in. So it's no mystery to folks that they target people first these days, phishing and the like, because we're the weakest link. So they will go after physical devices and applications that are exposed to what we call hybrid environments. So sure, that's probably a work laptop, but it also goes home, it goes to the airport, it goes various places. So the physical device environment is very difficult to defend. Now, Webroot does a very good job of that in defending those areas, but we think if you take it one step further, you can get the best of both worlds. And in that sense, that if you look at it from the perspective of creating a container that we defend in one place as opposed to all these physical devices, it allows us to concentrate the defense and then layer our approach, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's our primary argument on the security side is, and we do this in most of our presentations, talk about what is a workspace, because there's been different definitions thrown out there in the industry. But to us, it's a container where applications and file and even software as a service-based links can all be integrated into one place for each employee. Typically, they're hosted as web-based sessions in a Windows Server environment, but they act as a container for the employee that looks like and works like a physical desktop working in a local area network from the old client server days. The big advantage, of course, is these are all virtual so that they're hosted in the cloud and allows us to put the defense around that particular set of sessions and that particular set of workspaces. How we deliver that is up to the employee, is up pretty much to the client. We can actually deliver it as an interactive desktop. We can also actually deliver it as streamed applications. So Word could actually come right down to your physical device, looking like it's running on the device, but it's actually being hosted up in a workspace in the cloud. So we are very flexible in how people can consume the actual applications and data, but it does give us that central point to defend. And the other part, we make the point that this is a replacement for targets that have been out there for a long time. And we've thought of everything we can do for defending the desktops and the laptops, but this approach allows us to say, hey, we're going to segregate and create a container for business information, business applications, and then I can access that from anywhere that has an internet connection. So I get the best of both worlds from that perspective. So let's talk about the workplace security and see how we characterize why this is an effective approach to defending business data and business applications. As we talked about, it's encapsulated in the cloud. So an attack from a malicious piece of software actually has to get through the defenses of whatever cloud vendor you're using, and it has to know how to get around the controls that we place in the environment. So typically for our workspaces, we start out with a very locked down environment. For example, you can't get access to the C drive as an end user. You can't run applications that are not on your entitlement list. You can't get access to Task Manager and other places to start up runaway processes and things like that. So that particular environment allows us to be as locked down as we want to, and then vary the rights for particular types of users. So administrators, for instance, might have access to assigning permissions on different file folders so that people can get access to the folder they need. Same thing for applications. We can lock down that list so that you only get access to the accounting applications if you're in finance, for instance, or your access to the engineering applications if you're in the CAD or the engineering group. But the theory is that these workspaces are very locked down to start with, and then we loosen up the control for those pieces. The other point I wanted to make in terms of this is that these workspaces run on virtual servers, and virtual servers can be snapshotted so that we have a last known good version of all of the applications and data pretty much as often as we want. We could do it every 4 hours, we could do it every night, we could do it every week. So that sort of mitigates some of the attacks where they're trying to lock up or encrypt your data, and that information is then ransomed so that you actually have to pay to get the information back. Well, that strategy doesn't work very well if you're actually able to take a backup from last night and say, okay, well, I'm just going to start over from that point, and if we lost 6 hours of data, that's a much smaller price than having to go through a ransom process. Let's also talk a little bit about the endpoint security, because George mentioned that the name of the game with some of these attacks is to try and find the weak port or the missing security on one of the endpoints and then work your way into the middle and into the important stuff from there. So from our perspective, you have to run all of these workspaces running a TLS, most modern TLS version connection from all the endpoints. So that's the workspace, that's the management, both our API and our web application require that, so that if you're doing either work in the workspace itself as an end user or you're administering and managing the workspaces as an administrator, we lock down both of those components. We're a strong believer that you should have CA signed certificates, so self-signing certificates for a production workspace environment. We don't believe that's a good idea. So we really encourage folks to go through the process of actually getting a known CA to certify that the DNS endpoint that you're talking to is really that endpoint. We also use a service account management model. So as we talked about, the users are pretty locked down, but even our service accounts that do things like work with domain entries and work with Active Directory, those accounts are locked down as well, so that they can't be utilized as an automated or unattended mechanism to get to important stuff. We talked about a little bit, we run an API for most of our methods and management features. All are API accessible, but they're accessible via an authentication process that requires receiving a token back and using that token for every subsequent call. It's a REST-based API, so we respond to those requests and have a relatively small profile for sharing information even within the method so that we don't send out more information than somebody needs, which can then be utilized by a malicious actor to try and get into the environment. So again, even if the actual workspaces themselves are secured, it's also important to take the management channel and doing the same level of communication. And the last piece, any internal communication endpoints, whether it's client-server in the workspace area, whether it's our components talking to each other, because we do have several components that are hosted in the cloud, it's very important for internal communications to be talking to known endpoints, so whitelisting IPs and things like that, and using an encrypted channel for that. So we follow all those security elements as well. As we talked about at the beginning of the half here, as George said, there's a couple ways to do this. What we're suggesting here is that if you take the workspace and use Cloud Workspace Suite to generate these workspaces and provision them, and then apply the next layer, so use the Webroot components to defend against those attack vectors, then the combination of those makes it very difficult for a standard generic attack that is basically playing the odds. Right? So if they're sending out 1 million or 2 million emails to try and get a certain percentage of that to respond, and they have to defeat these defenses, at a certain point it doesn't really become cost effective for the attacker to try and work their way through all these different obstacles if you combine these different layers of security. So the combination of a workspace that you can defend in one data center or one cloud, plus adding the Webroot components on top of that, and we do have end clients doing that successfully and very effectively, gives you a defense that really raises the price for an attack and makes it so that you can actually evolve over time in both your policy setting for what the workspace has access to, as well as the Webroot products as they figure out more attack vectors based on the large amount of data they're getting. That combination gives you the best defense that you can pay for with a cloud approach. Just wanted to talk briefly about the Cloud Workspace Suite. I keep referring to a workspace, but one of the things that everybody says, well, that's a great idea, but it's kind of hard to set one of those up. And how does your product help us with that? Well, we go through a process of creating these workspaces and giving you the tool set that allows you to take pretty much an empty container, the workspace, and add the applications for each user, add the configuration that they need. Some applications need registry settings and things like that. Some of them need certain file structures and file shares to work with. Other ones need to, if they're client server, they need to run on a collection of servers as opposed to one server. All of those particular elements are handled by our product. So what does that give you in the end? Well, we talked about it's a customizable work area and workspace for each user. Not everyone, you can have different users with different setups all in the same company. As we talked about, we handle application and file entitlement management, which is really important in the security side. If I can't run applications that is not on the entitlement list, then it makes it very difficult for a new executable to jump in there and try and create an attack. Same thing with file level stuff. We allow users to have an area to share to save their personal files, but also sort of a virtual file server approach for sharing files across the company. But that's it. We don't allow you to get to different drives and volumes that you really shouldn't have access to. One of the big features that we think about is that all this information is there, but it's also accessible whether I'm at home, at work, if I'm traveling, if I need to get access from a variety of different devices. That's all possible with a workspace as opposed to having to create, say, a VPN, which does give you access, but also creates another attack vector from any location where the VPN is activated from the client side. So this allows you to say, okay, you can get to it from anywhere you're currently working, but the defense is all, again, through that one known port. Also simplifies an application upgrade process and sort of replaces the break-fix problem that a lot of folks face today. You can use relatively interchangeable end devices like Ultrabooks, Chromebooks, and leave the heavy configuration to a cloud area that's easier to administer. You can actually replace just the end devices with another end device and take all the ones that are broken and fix those all at one time. And the final piece is that we're aware that there are a lot of folks that run service-based or SaaS-based applications. But within this environment, because the identity is managed in a standard Windows way, you can still do your single sign-on. You can still do application identity sharing. People are familiar with the log-on with Google or log-on with Office 365 type credentialing. Both of those also work in a workspace. So you can actually create one integrated environment where you know exactly what employees are accessing in terms of application and data. And then just a brief mention of the environments we're running. We'll talk about how public cloud differs from the private cloud in a second, but we effectively use those environments to create virtual servers, virtual Windows servers, and then create the workspaces from there. And the focus of our tool, as I mentioned, is to do the provisioning. So we create the VMs, we size the VMs, we make sure that the applications that you need installed get installed correctly, allow you to do configuration and post-configuration tasks with a scripting environment. We allow all the configuration you would need as if you were setting up a desktop, but you're just setting up a workspace. We also do the management piece, so everything from change user password to unlock a user because they tried the password too many times, to changing somebody's name because they got married. All the typical administrative stuff we actually administer from both the API and from a web application, so you don't have to dive into Active Directory or you don't have to jump in to the actual server itself to do that piece of it. Then the last piece is to integrate. We were aware that we're one component in typically a very hybrid and complex IT infrastructure. So we have our API accessible for both the ordering side, creating workspaces and things like that, as well as accessing it for entitlement usage, billing, resource management, and trending and all that type of stuff. So the platform is meant to be a plug-in to a bigger IT environment. Okay, just a couple of words on both the public cloud and the private cloud because they differ a little bit. And our experience in using Azure, the Google Compute Platform, and Amazon is that all those vendors have a very clear security infrastructure for the IaaS level, so virtual machines all the way down into the physical hardware, as well as the networking components that provide everything from multi-region access to high availability to load balancing, all those types of components. And they've done a fairly good job of defining enough flexibility so that you can configure your security and your infrastructure environment so that you get as much access as you need to, but also allows you to enforce policy and enforce security rules. So what we encourage our customers to do is to work with these vendors to understand their standards and certification compliance features in the platform. So, for instance, Google will work on a HIPAA business affiliate relationship document with you if that's something you require. Or they'll actually go through and help you with PCI compliance if you're taking credit cards. Microsoft does the same thing. The process with Amazon works as well. So we see them as sort of a halfway, they get you 50 or 60% of the way you need to start with a good security perimeter at the foundation, and then you use workspaces and applications and data with best practices on top of that, allows you to defend that perimeter. So it's a really good starting point, and the pricing has become a lot more competitive in recent months so that you can actually put together a pretty neat environment that's really secure. And we'll skip the private cloud. I think we got too many divider slides in there. On the private cloud, we deal with vendors that are running VMware. They're co-hosting or co-location or hosted what's called IaaS infrastructure as a service environment, typically running VMware or Hyper-V. They also have done a fair amount of job of locking down their environments, and we actually work with a configuration component in our product to match those environments. So whether it's a private subnet or a set of machines that can actually talk to the hypervisor API, or naming mechanism for the virtual machines so that they're all in the same grouping and that you can lock down by policy. Everybody has sort of a different flavor of both the governance and control APIs as well as the physical infrastructure management APIs, and our product is meant to be agnostic to that so that we can actually run on any of those hypervisors, any of those public hypervisor environments, so that you can actually configure the environment the way you want to and are compliant with the underlying infrastructure provider. And again, these guys usually have their own mechanism for helping out with standards and certification compliance, so we typically work with them to make sure that everybody can get their certification done. And that's about it. Just wanted to reiterate a couple of the high points here, that we believe the workspaces are a good way to offer a integrated and comprehensive working environment for employees, but at the same time to concentrate our defenses around one set of servers that are already defended by their location in a data center. And then secondly, the layering approach, we absolutely endorse that as well as the Webroot folks do, because we think the more places you can put in some defense, the better off you're going to be in the long term. So that's pretty much my side of it. So I think Michael was going to come back and see if there's any questions.
Yes. Hey, great stuff, guys. This is Michael again. Interesting, very, very interesting stuff. We do have a whole bunch of questions, so I want to jump right into those if I may. All right, so first up is, would malware always see if it's in a sandbox? This question came in earlier. We wanted to wait to the end with this, so that was from one of the earlier presentation slides. So would malware always see if it's in a sandbox?
The answer to that's no, not necessarily. It's whether it's constructed to see it. So often, people are trying to slide things past defenses, etc., and they know that they're going to face a certain sort of defense. They know that defense uses a form of emulation or a sandbox. It will try and avoid that. So it really depends on what the malware author is trying to do and achieve, and where it's trying to go. And one thing to remember always, which people tend to forget, we are the defenders. We are the ones that are facing the unknowns and the zeros and the things that have never been seen before. And it's basically, the attacker has the advantage because they can test your defenses before they attack, if you like. So they have a pretty good idea of whether they're going to get through or not sometimes. So that's why I said it's so important to have multi-layers in your product, because they maybe not actually find some of the layers they're doing because of the way that they're doing the particular testing. But that's one of the issues. So the answer is yes, if they designed it that way, it will. If they're not worried about that, or they've got an exploit that doesn't, isn't going to worry about that, then they're not going to worry about it either. So it's, just pays your money, takes your choice there. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Next question. Where is the Webroot app installed when using it in the cloud workspace?
The Webroot application is installed on the session servers themselves, and then configured for use by the actual end users.
Yeah,
typically.
To be honest, yeah.
Go ahead, George.
No, where you go.
I was also going to say that there's data servers like a client server app. It depends on the application, I think, as to whether they get extended from there.
Yeah. And the only thing I would say about it is because of our particular size, I know we work very well in virtual environments. A lot of people use us in virtual server environments and things like that. So it would be possible even to bring us up on an instance basis, I think, just because of our load times being so small and far, because we get used in those environments regularly, and we also use extremely low resources. One of the things that we're probably most famous for is our performance, if you like, overall performance in the sense of how much CPU, how much RAM, et cetera, et cetera. So that area, which we constantly get tested and we publish results about with Passmark and various other people. So I think there's different ways of us doing it. Mike and I have not colluded or chatted about this before this presentation has taken place, but I'm sure we'd be in different ways we could jointly work with each other and ensure we got you best protected.
Excellent. Okay, next question. Does the cloud workspace work with PayPal?
Let's see, work with PayPal. It's a little bit vague, but let me take a shot at it here. So the workspace itself works like a Windows desktop, and especially for browser-based applications, it will behave very similar to if you're running on a physical device. Now, there are some redirection and port issues that have to be worked out if you're looking to do outbound redirection and things like that, but part of what our Workspace product does is allows you to work with the external firewall to make sure that that port traffic gets directed to the right place. So every one of the Workspace sessions, or even if it's multiple session servers, has a publicly available DNS entry that gets routed through the gateway. So even though it's a virtual machine, it does still get perceived as a routable DNS level machine, if you will. It just has to go through that extra layer of going through a gateway. But definitely a configuration approach to support pretty much all the applications that are native to the browsers and to the web.
Yeah, I still a little add to that a little bit because as far as the DNS layer goes, we actually have a DNS service, a secure DNS server. So people have obviously DNS at the gateway, but we can affect policy at the DNS server level, literally at the domain level out in the internet before it even gets to the network. So that sort of defense layer typically stops maybe up to 90% of any malware that can possibly come down through that DNS connection. So there are different layers and different spaces where you can protect the network or protect the devices connecting out to the internet. So that's interesting too. That's another way we could definitely work with Independence IT and their technology.
Okay, a couple more questions coming in. Let's see. Microsoft used to offer Azure Remote App as an application streaming option. Can I use Cloud Workspace as a replacement for this?
Short answer is yes. We were actually just out there a couple months ago, and the Microsoft decision to pull Remote App from Azure wasn't really based around its effectiveness. In fact, it was more popular than they thought it was going to be. It was more towards Microsoft deciding that they wanted to provide the underlying technology, namely remote data sessions and RDP, the protocol, and allow vendors such as IIT to provide the application installation, management, configuration, and workflow capabilities, because we have a lot more experience with that, and we can help end users and clients configure the environment as they see fit, whereas Microsoft's more about providing the platform and doing that piece of it. So Cloud Workspace actually works, as we talked about, in two different ways. You can either have the workspace, which is the traditional desktop, or you can deliver any application via streaming application using the Remote App technology that Microsoft added to the RDP protocol a number of years ago. We've also talked to them. They just released some information about a new streamlined environment they're calling RDS-MI that allows us to do a lot better job of providing the Remote App access via browsers and web pages as opposed to just an RDP configuration. We do a lot to make that process streamlined already. So if you have interest in that, let us know. But the good news is that Microsoft has seen the wisdom of combining some of the web-based components of RDS with the capability to deliver it via browsers.
Okay, next up, does your product size the remote session servers for the number of users or number of active sessions?
Good question. We started out with the former. We said, okay, total number of users, we should be able to size the RDS session servers based on you have 25 employees in the company, so we'll make it big enough to handle 25, or we'll split it between two servers and make it big enough for 12. What we found that is just like a lot of applications, not everybody's using sessions at the same time. So we've actually added a couple options. One of them is based on user activity to determine how big the servers should be and how many servers that we should have active at any one time. So we take a scaling approach to say, okay, if you have 150 users spread out across the U.S., we'll size the machines to handle, let's say there's 4 or 5 of those machines. We'll size them to all handle a fifth of the load, but we won't turn on servers 2, 3, 4, and 5 until you actually get to that number of users during the day. So that's really helped people control resource costs. The other element that we work with is we allow you to schedule it. So if you know that in your business, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. is the only real time people are using sessions, we help folks turn off servers from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. There's always an emergency sort of trigger switch to turn one back on if we need it, but we've done a lot more based on feedback from our end user base and our partners that matching the resources as servers are needed is much better approach than saying, oh, gross number of users is this, and we'll size them and create a number of quantity servers to actually build it. So matching it to actually who's using what is becoming a lot more effective, and the tools that both the public and private cloud vendors have gotten a lot better over time to allow us to do that.
Okay, great. Next up, can you basically, why choose Webroot over your competitors? I'm just going to paraphrase this question. Why Webroot over competitors?
Good question. I think there's a number of reasons. It's particularly if you're an MSP or a managed service provider, I think there's lots of good reasons for doing it. I mean, table stakes obviously is efficacy, and always the ability to stop and prevent infections and do that in a highly effective way. And I think we've consistently proved ourselves to be able to do that. And we've grown dramatically with MSPs over the last three or so years, where we've got over 9,500 MSPs at the moment. I think our renewal rate with MSPs is, again, in the high 90-odd%. So we're not sort of an overnight wonder in that space. It's something we're starting to become very established in. And I think the reasons that MSPs bias is that we're particularly easy to deploy and particularly easy to manage, and we're particularly easy to operate on an ongoing basis. So when they're looking at putting together their particular stack of services that they're going to offer their customers, they know they got something that's going to do the job for them, that actually as a service element has got a low service cost, if you like, because basically every time they get a service cost, a support call, whatever, it's actually them, I wouldn't say losing money, but it's definitely costing them money at that stage. So they find that it's not only the fact that we're easy to deal with and deploy in the first place, we're actually easy to run and manage and use on an ongoing basis. I think the other reason is that we have done an immense amount of effort to make ourselves work the way that MSPs in particular work. So with RMM and PSA tools, we have our own sort of API. So basically, if you've got any scripting capability, you can use our API and generate personalized reports and do a whole lot of very sophisticated, very tailored things, if you like, for your customers and go from that angle. So I think there's a lot of good reasons, but those are the main ones. But I mean, as I said, the table stakes in any game when you're buying endpoint security is: are you protecting that user? Are you protecting that device? Are you doing that in a highly effective way so that you're not getting calls or rebuilds? And of course, things like auto remediation that I mentioned earlier as well sort of adds into that. The fact that we can take a machine, even though it's supposedly infected, we contain it, we can protect the user, and we can sort of take the machine back to its last known good state. Whereas a lot of the time, if people get infected, the only thing they can do is actually re-image the device if they miss it. So, lots of good things.
Okay, great. Someone else is chiming in here with, I've got several customers that are thinking about moving everything to cloud. Do you have any tips for helping them think about the move?
It's one of the, at least from the workspace side, the migration movement, it seems to be on in sort of a gold rush type fashion. A lot of folks are deciding that the server in the server room or the dressed up server closet, which is really just a closet, they're ready to move their components up to a cloud workspace solution. So what we typically talk about with folks is an inventory step first. Which applications are you running? What kind of files do you have? Where are they living? What are you using for email? Have you moved to G Suite or to Office 365 for that? So the first step is to understand those components and then come up with a strategy for creating the workspace first and then migrating the data and applications second. And then the final piece is to actually migrate the users and say, okay, instead of logging into your local Active Directory, for instance, you can actually log into the cloud one when you come in on Monday morning. We've also had folks want to do it sort of a piece-by-piece approach where they want to run Active Directory like they have for the last 25 years on their internal IT on-premises components and applications, but they want to move one application at a time. So we call that a hybrid environment. People typically can, using ADFS, Active Directory Federation services, we can actually hook up the cloud identity with the local identity. So the user still logs in the same way, but we're starting to provide some of the applications from the cloud and typically stream them down using remote app. And then over time, as we get everything moved, they'll switch to a full workspace environment. So you can either do the forklift approach, or you could do the migration approach, but we feel that the understanding what you have to work with first and then figuring out a plan for migration is the right way to do it.
Excellent. All right, another question came in. Do we have a case study for the use of the cloud workspace with a non-profit environment? Now, before you answer that question, if that is something that might be a yes, maybe we could make it available versus necessarily describing the whole thing. But again, just the gentleman's asking about, is there a case study for using cloud workspace for nonprofit?
I know we have a number of case studies that are both either education focused or healthcare focused, which I think is the closest. We do have customers in the nonprofit space, typically their big draw for them is they're either multi-location or they have multiple chapters, for instance, that come in. So on the IIT side, we can definitely get you the information on that type of customer profile and how people are using it.
Okay, sounds good. Also, a quick another one. Are there bandwidth concerns when using the cloud workspace?
There's bandwidth minimums. What I would say is that RDP, which is the Microsoft protocol, or even the Citrix protocol, we run some of those as well, that those have improved a lot over time. And we've worked with folks to sort of identify what the typical latency and then packet loss is from a particular environment into those environments. I personally have used it from some really slow airport Wi-Fi all the way through. I'm running today on Verizon Fios. So all of those elements are definitely supported. The other part of it is we've done a fair amount in our client. So when you connect to our environment to actually take a snapshot of the network performance and give you the average latency and how long it takes for it to talk to both the gateway and to our API so that we can identify whether or not you're having difficulty with the network itself. So that's a pre-step before you'd even get too far with it. We could help you do some analysis as to, okay, is this environment right for workspace sessions? But I would say over the last, say, decade or so, we've gotten a lot better so that we can run in a lot, 85, 90% of the situations are very usable. And I hardly notice. I actually have run, I'm one of those sad people that has actually 3 workspaces running for different reasons, all off the same physical device, and I'm very, very much most of the time, I'm not aware that I'm on a workspace.
Okay, another question. There's a lot of new players coming on the market. Can you talk about those as they pertain to Webroot MVP?
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting area. I think some of the new players are sort of, I would say, are very focused on the infection stage and that stage and only that stage. So they're really looking at, how do I whitelist an environment? How do I tune my product to that environment? And then looking at what's known in that environment and sort of setting a benchmark. But they're only looking at that particular stage. So there's no layers to protect the user. There's no other thing. There's just a sort of a single focus on that. I think some of the others are more what I would call EDR focused, which is enterprise detection and response focused. So they're interested in sort of using the endpoint data, stopping things, and then giving you sort of a whole lot of things about the kill chain and how it happened and how it got in and what stages. And while that's useful, it's that retrospective information is not as useful as actual stopping things earlier on and doing other things. I think in many ways, and I know larger organizations probably have the time and the resources to look at that data, but most of the businesses we deal with, which are small, medium-sized businesses, either haven't got the expertise or the personnel or the time. So I think you've got to very carefully look at what you're trying to achieve from your endpoint protection. And we all do things different ways, but if you're looking for efficacy, something that's easy to manage, something that's easy to deploy, something which is a reasonable cost, and a whole lot of other things that you can use in a services environment, and what I would call MSP ready, then I think Webroot it differentiates itself from all those sort of newer entrants to the market, which are not really chasing or looking to help MSPs at all.
All right, great. And we did have another person interested in the case studies, so maybe what we can do is the Webroot team afterwards can maybe provide links to that, or the Channel Pro team, we can figure that out afterwards. But to the questions that came in regarding that, we'll make definitely point folks towards those resources. That looks like wrapping up all the questions that we've got here. Just want to know if Michael or George, you've got any kind of parting thoughts, and maybe George can wrap us up.
This is Mike. Want to thank everybody for attending. And if you have any follow-up questions, as we said, I'm happy to have a more in-detailed discussion or a live demo with folks if workspaces might fit into your strategy. So thanks very much again for our host, Webroot, and Channel Pro.
Okay, George?
Yeah, I'd just like to round up by saying that it's obvious now there's lots of other ways and different ways you can think of your IT, and IT moving to the cloud is something we've seen for ages. I mean, we're a cloud-based company ourselves. We're a cloud-driven company, and I think I'm seeing desktop as a service in this sort of area is something that's starting to sort of like blossom and grow. And I think you've got to think also there's got to be unless it's a dumb terminal, which is more about the client server thing. You've got to be protecting that device at that end as well as the user at that end. Never mind if they're what they're connecting into too, because otherwise there is the risk always, even with screen grabs and things like that, of information leaking out that you wouldn't want to get out of the way. So security is about is looking at what you're using and then looking at the ways it could be compromised, and then looking at the layers you could put in, whether that's endpoint, whether that's DNS, whatever it happens to be, and educating your users, of course, as well. And it's combining all these things together that's going to make your clients safer and also the chances of infection and compromise, and the fact that you're going to be faced with a bill to clean it up less and less likely. And as we progress, anything we know about technology, it constantly changes. New things will happen, and we've got to be aware of those things as well. So hopefully webinars like this help you do that. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today.
Well, great. Again, this is Michael Siggins from Channel Pro Network. And Michael Walsh, I want to thank you very much for your time today. And, of course, George Anderson and everybody over at Webroot. To all our attendees, great participation, great feedback that really helps our presenters really dig deeper into the topic, and we really got into that today. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very, very much for your time. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier, we will be doing a follow-up to everybody who did attend and registered for the session today with some of that follow-up information that we discussed. So on behalf of everybody, this is Michael, and I want to say thank you all for joining, and we wish you best and much success with your businesses, and we're going to wrap things up here. So thanks very much for coming, and take care, and goodbye now.